We have the tremendous privilege of being here with Shabbos Kestenbaum, a powerhouse, a vocal piece for on-campus rights for Jewish people across the nation and world. And really, it's a tremendous privilege to be able to speak with him. We want to delve right in and go straight to the heart of what's going on over here. And we're just discussing just the idea of politics and how does someone who doesn't really identify with the world of politics and hierarchy, but who fights for truth and justice, live in a world where you're inherently having to be political. And how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I navigate it with great difficulty. So first of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it and making the time for this conversation. I was always interested in politics, but that's because I existed outside of the political culture. And then after October 7th, when I was sort of thrust into both the national spotlight and the political culture, it became readily apparent that if you want truth, and perhaps most fundamentally, if you want change, this actually is not the avenue by which you would do it. I don't have an organization. I don't have a title. I don't have a fancy, well, I guess I do have a fancy degree. But I know that there are thousands of young Americans, in particular young American Jews, who can and currently are making change and searching for truth, even without the political process or a fancy title. And this really brings to mind one of my spiritual heroes, Menachem Mendel Morgenstern, otherwise known as the Kutzker Rebbe. And he was known for one thing and one thing only, and that was fighting for truth. In fact, the background of my screen for the last 6 years has been a picture of his grave, which is a little dark, but it actually gives me a tremendous amount of inspiration, because whether I'm in the White House or speaking at a synagogue or just, chatting with a friend, and I open my phone and see him and what he represents, it reminds me that no matter who you are with or what you're doing, you must always have as a North Star truth, MS. That has been my guiding light, and people can disagree with the ways in which I arrive at truth. They can disagree with my politics, but I hope that even my worst ideological adversaries, I hope that they think that at least I'm genuine about the things I'm saying.
Where did that journey for truth begin with? Because truth is a midah. It's a spiritual quality. And these are things that we develop and nurture. Some of them give us more doses earlier on in life than others. But is that something that you were born with, something that you fostered and were forced to foster in certain circumstances of your life?
I think it's probably the latter. I think I was probably forced into it because my Judaism, for example, was not particularly something I thought about much. It's obviously something I did. It was something I related to, but you don't really have to fight for your Judaism when you're growing up in a modern Orthodox community and going to a Jewish day school. And even if you wanted to eat non-kosher, there are only kosher restaurants in the area. And I knew, of course, Harvard would be a challenge, not really because of anti-Semitism, but because it was actually the first time I was on a campus and taking classes with different genders and different ideologies and different religions. That, to me, was probably the biggest culture shock. And yeah, I was forced, again, even leaving aside anti-Semitism, but I was forced to defend, articulate, and advance why it is I believe what I believe. When most outsiders who've never met a Jew, they will say, well, why do you need the kippah? Well, why do you need to have certain dietary laws? Well, why do you need to pray 3 times a day? And if you don't actually have good answers, not only will they be disappointed, but you will find that internally you'll start asking yourself, yeah, why do I do those things? So I had to actually, I had a bit of an internal journey and discovering what my Judaism actually meant to me. And the conclusion was, it means a great deal. As I said earlier, Judaism is not an aspect of my identity. Judaism is my identity.
100%. And it feels like this is what the sages talk about. It says, Al tagam game, don't stumble. You have to be chidus bepivcha. It has to be sharp in your mouth. And I feel like obviously the battles that we're putting into life, like these are the battlegrounds, these are the testing grounds where we're sharpening our own hearts and minds. And God's the greatest teacher of all. And I feel like, Hashem wants to see how each one of us are going to maximize our potential in this world. And unless you have a sparring partner, right, and put you into that arena and have you fight, you're not going to achieve your ultimate best self. So you feel like in some ways this is part of your divine journey, being put in those situations and having to bring those parts of your personality out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say I'm a little bit like Moshe, only in the sense of he didn't actually want to do it. Not that I'm a leader or gifted or anything. I just didn't really want to do it. The lawsuit happens to be a really good example. I did not want to file the lawsuit against Harvard. And especially I did not want to use my name. But no one else wanted to do it. And I felt it was super important for the American people to actually put a name to a face and realize these are real people who are being impacted, as opposed to anonymous plaintiff number 1 and anonymous plaintiff number 2. So I would only agree with the divine plan only in the sense of I didn't want to be part of the divine plan. I wish it was someone else.
You know who said the same thing? Moses.
Well, there you go. There you go.
Moses is like, I don't want to be part of this thing. For a week, God's like negotiating the contract. I was like, I don't want to be there. Okay, so it's a similar thing. But I think I want to say, like, first of all, a big thank you, because I personally, I look up to you, and I feel like it's very, and no, in the sense that there is a lot of tremendous respect when people put themselves out there, right? Because you are now a face and you are now present, and those have implications socially, personally, professionally, financially, spiritually, and sometimes they're not always for the benefit. And now you're there, right? And sometimes there's a sense of like, what will be the consequence of this? There's a beautiful person, it's Anna Darshan Leitner, who fights terrorism through legal means, right? Through a company called Shortad and her organization.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
I'm speaking at their conference.
Okay, so
And I spoke at their conference last year too.
So her and her husband are amazing, and I remember having an encounter with them just a few years ago when they were here. And I said, like, "Aren't you ever afraid?" Right? And obviously, the whole situation with Charlie Kirk and the palpable reality of like being targets is something that like there's a certain amount of like, well, how do you overcome that? And I feel like that's for me, like, how do you overcome that?
Well, first of all, just because you mentioned Charlie Kirk, it's worth it to say that my first interaction with him was backstage at the Republican convention, and I had confided into him how nervous I was to give my speech, and he reassuringly says, "Shabbos, so long as you're fighting for the truth, you have nothing to fear," which, number one, exemplifies who Charlie was, but number two, really relates to our point, that so long as you're fighting for the truth, there's not much to be afraid of. And I cannot control the actions or behaviors or attitudes of our ideological adversaries. I can only control myself, and I am not going to change to accommodate other people's bigotry and hatred and discrimination. And it actually sort of reminds me of a similar line from the Kutzker Rebbe, going back to my spiritual hero, where he essentially tells his followers, it's not that I don't want you not to sin, it's that I want you to be so busy in mitzvos that you actually don't have time to sin. So too, I kind of look at my activism, or the activism of so many tremendous Jewish fighters and activists, and say it's not really that they're not afraid, it's that they're doing so much good, they don't really think about the consequences. And those are people I look up to, who are so immersed in their work and in their calling. Is it dangerous? Is it uncomfortable? Are they fearful? Yeah, probably, but they don't have time because they're doing so good.
As they say in Yiddish, Sag weiter. Just keep on
Yeah.
going. You know, I was thinking about this concept of hate, because I feel like in some ways we're battling hatred. And I was thinking to myself, like, where does hate go? I don't know if you've meditated on this thought process, but like when we think about the depth of what students and who will be young professionals and young families and these individuals who are now espousing such venom in the communities and the world around us, what happens to that in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? And we were meditating that, my wife and I were like, whatever happened? What happened to Nazi Germany post 1945? How did the Germans feel about it? Like, what was their corrective experience? Because you look at Germany today and its policies and where it is socially and economically in terms of how they understand the Holocaust retroactively and retroflectively. And you say to yourself, like, is that a model to look at? Or do we say, like, you know, there's still more to go and there's still more to learn? And
yeah, that's an interesting comparison. With Nazi Germany, the year 1945 in German history is referred to as year zero, because it was total obliteration, and they were forced to restart because they had nothing by which they could continue with. And I guess that would be analogous to someone who is so hateful that they simply self-implode, and they simply destroy all their relationships. They destroy their sense of self that they have to repair. They have to be someone else. So hopefully it doesn't get to that point. What I would say is, I'm not particularly hateful, but I am particularly angry. I get angry quite often. And I have woken up from October 8th of 2023 to October of 2025. I have woken up angry, and I've gone to sleep angry at so many people and so many organizations and so many ideologies. But I think that I channel my anger into something practical like activism, and that allows me to deal with the pain that I'm experiencing. And correct me if I'm wrong, you're obviously the rabbi, I'm not, but I think it's the Talmud that says that for every bad, there's a good. For every action, there's a reaction. So too, if you have a hateful tendency, or you have a tendency to be angry, then what's the counter to that? And so, as I said, I think my activism has sort of cooled me down, even though internally I still struggle a lot. But I'd like to think that I'm doing something worthwhile. And if I didn't think what I was doing was worthwhile, I would have stopped.
how does your faith balance or play a part of your activism?
Well, my faith is my activism, and my activism, I guess, is my faith to a lesser extent. But I'm only an activist insofar as it advances my faith and the faith of the Jewish people. I always say that I do not combat anti-Semitism, and it often frustrates me when I am written up as someone who does that, because that's really not what I do, which might surprise people, because if they know me, they'll know me as the guy who sued Harvard for anti-Semitism. But in reality, I care way less about fighting against, and I care way more about fighting for Jewish values, Jewish peoplehood, the Jewish state. That's really what animates me. So my activism is rooted in a tremendous sense of purpose and meaning in my religion. And if I did not have that, I wouldn't be doing this. And I actually often wonder this, because there are very few Orthodox slash from Jewish activists in the pro-Israel space. Most of them are either like actual atheists. Shai Davidai, for example, he's a friend of mine, and I really think the world of him. He is also very open about his atheism, I'm not attacking him for that. I'm just stating a fact that he's open about. Most of the influencers in the pro-Israel space that I know of are religiously secular, and I actually find it, at least personally, quite nice that I get to be in those exact same spaces and be friends with Shai and be friends with some of these people, and also wear a kippah. And as much as even though I'd say I'm not fighting anti-Semitism, as much as I'm fighting anti-Semitism from the outside, I'm also on the inside trying to give a good name to Orthodox Jews. And we're not these insular, misogynistic, backwards, archaic Jews that perhaps you may have surmised we are.
It really emphasizes the idea of what is Kiddush Hashem. Right? When we talk about sanctifying God's name, I always like, okay, Kiddush Hashem, because I go out to the world and they see who I am and I sanctify God's name, and that is true. But if you go double click on the Gemara itself, where they talk about Kiddush Hashem is primarily around other Jews. When other Jews or a minion of other Jews see an act that you do, right, that is called Chilul Hashem or Kiddush Hashem. And therefore we see like that internal recognition and light that we resound and say positively, like that is the main way that we sanctify God's name, which I think is an interesting point. So as you're emphasizing
that is an interesting point, and I'll use your podcast as a platform to say this. It's great speaking in Orthodox synagogues or in Orthodox communities. I mean, I feel at home, but
welcome in.
but one of the things I wish I was better at was speaking at Reform temples or conservative synagogues or wherever, because number one, I don't have much exposure to them, and I would imagine vice versa, they don't have much exposure to us, and we probably disagree more. And that's good. That's very healthy and vital for a democracy in American context, but also for religion to have disagreements while also realizing that we're all part of the same team. So, if any of your listeners are out there, I would love to be speaking at more reform and conservative temples or liberal institutions, because we would probably disagree respectfully on some things, but that actually, I would say, makes us a lot stronger.
100%. I think we're trying to build that inherent bond, and I feel like in some ways, the events of October 7th has been polarizing. On the one hand, we can say, and this is just a commentary on like, what does Israel politics look like today? How after October 7th, there was such a mending and blending of heart and soul of the Jewish people. And now today, does that really shine the same way 2 years out? Right. And I think that there's a big question amongst the Frum world over there and the other Jews who are within Israel, and how it has created sometimes even more factionalism that pre-existed it. Right. And so there's always a challenge over here when we're forced to reconcile and trying to find identities together, and how do we come close? And ultimately, we are trying to find common ground and find common love with our fellow Jews at every single way. So if you're listening out there, please feel free to book Shabbos.
Yes.
Any place where you're interested, wherever you are.
And if I could add one last point to that, unity does not mean uniformity.
Correct.
Unity recognizes that, yes, we do have differences, but ultimately, as I said, we're part of the same team. We're part of the same people. We all have the same goal. We may disagree on tactics and strategies and how best to arrive at that goal, but the goal is still the same. And let's use a contemporary example. Everyone wants the hostages back, and everyone wants the war to end, and everyone wants Hamas to be dismantled. Now, we can quibble about, does that mean ceasefire at all costs? Does that mean a partial hostage release? Does that mean Bibi's out? That we can disagree with. But fundamentally, we're a lot more unified, even with our disagreements, than I think people give themselves credit for.
I think that this is something that we've maybe lost a nuance for, but there used to be tribes, as we know. like in the Jewish people. And today, you have your Cohen, you have your Levi, you have your Yisrael. But obviously, there was the many other tribes of Yehuda, Yisachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. We had 12 different tribes, and a fundamental paradigm is teaching us this archetype of like, yes, there is differences, and God wants the differences to be there, right? And that's why part of this messianic, return process will be this return of these 10 tribes, so to speak, which are these spiritual archetypes of like, yes, we have to accept there's different ways of how we serve God in the world, and like those are all valid, right? And I think like this is like a nuance. When the Jews were crossing through Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, right? They had like these massive walls. So it's brought down from the sages that like the walls had windows. Why do you need windows? The walls were clear. They were able to be seen through. They were like, those crystal bricks that people put in their houses, old school style. You can see them anyway, but why do they have windows? And then one of the ideas is brought through is because Hashem wanted us to validate the idea that like, I see them and they're also walking in their own path, their own shvil in Judaism, and that's valid. That's 100%. And like, they're totally part of me and I'm a part of them. And yeah, I'm here and they're there, but they're just as valid. Right. And I feel like that validity and having realization of like open dialogue. And I feel like that's so much a part of what the Jewish people are about. Let's talk. Let's discuss. Let's hear different points of view. Like when we talk about giving psak halacha, like what is the final day law of which something should be? There's a process for that, right? Sometimes you had to have one decision sometimes in certain matters, but the process itself needs to have multiplicity and and I really think like you're a great champion of look, because by hook or by crook, people are going to be forced to reconcile and reckon with what you're bringing to the table.
Appreciate that.
I know you just brought up an idea that, facts don't have feelings, but also feelings don't have facts.
Facts don't care about your
facts
feelings.
Don't care about your, thank you.
Feelings don't care about your facts. Yeah. Ben Shapiro has this is his line, so he gets all the credit. Of course, facts don't care about your feelings. And what he means by that is you may have emotional connotations, but data is still data and objectivity is still objectivity. He's obviously absolutely right about that. I have found, though, in the course of my activism since October 7th, is the inverse is also true, that feelings don't care about your facts. And that's actually quite negative. I'm not saying that as a positive thing. That means that even in the face of insurmountable evidence, data, logic, such as Israel's not committing a genocide, if someone doesn't like Israel or someone doesn't like the Jews or someone just feels that there must be a genocide because they saw a really horrendous picture of an innocent civilian being killed, then they don't really care about the facts because they have their feelings. And when people ask me, how do you overcome that? I wish I had a good answer. I don't know. I don't know how you can have a debate. We should have debates irrespective of that, but I don't know how you have a debate with someone whose starting position is not arriving at truth or data or the numbers, but just affirming their preconceived emotional feelings. That's actually really dangerous.
And how often do you get yourself into a circumstance when you're on a college campus, or do you not even encounter those anymore? Because you already know at this point, like, this is not a conversation.
Right. So to be fair, to be honest, I wish I encountered that a heck of a lot more than I do. Most of the people who come to hear me agree with me, which is nice. It's nice to come to a warm audience and they applaud and hopefully they laugh at what I say. But obviously what's more important is actually disagreeing. And perhaps I can convince people otherwise. But we have siloed ourselves so much into echo chambers that we would never even dare to think of going to someone's speech whose opinions we disagree with. And as I said, that's really dangerous for a democracy. It's really counter to what institutions of higher learning are meant to be. And I don't know. I don't have any good answers as to how we get ourselves out of that really, really deep hole. My attitude is I go to people who disagree with me because I want to learn from them. And in fact, this is not a very orthodox approach, so I'm not encouraging anyone to do this, but I got into a conversation with a Mormon missionary recently on the street. And I basically told him, because I was wearing my kippah, I said, I'm quite obviously Jewish and I'm very comfortable in my Judaism and I like being Jewish. But I said, I'm a rational person. So if you can make a very convincing argument as to how Joseph Smith was the prophet and how the Book of Mormon is the true testament of Jesus Christ, and it makes sense, then I'm happy to be convinced. It happens to be, I don't think they made good arguments, but my attitude, and again, this is not a very good Orthodox thing to do, so no one do this.
Please consult your local Orthodox rabbi.
Yes, and he'll say no, so you shouldn't do this. It just happened to be, I came across a Mormon missionary, but my attitude is, if you can convince me, I'm happy to be convinced, but I haven't really heard any good arguments yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess for yourself, though, I guess that we'll double click on that piece of the puzzle is do you feel certainly convinced about your Judaism so much so?
Yeah, for sure.
For sure.
I mean, I went to Aish Torah, a yeshiva in the old city of Jerusalem, where they encourage and really demand of the student that they ask and they find for themselves. I spent a long time searching, and I'm still searching. I think everyone is always searching. That's life. Life is a process of finding and hopefully discovering at some point, but ultimately of searching. And yeah, I'm pretty confident in my Judaism. And I'll be honest, as much as I said I'm a rational person, if I wasn't confident in my Judaism and if I didn't think there was a logic behind it, I wouldn't be doing it. but I am doing it.
Saying the proof is in the pudding.
Pretty much. I mean, again, I'm a man of my word. If someone can convince me that what we're doing is just so wrong and so egregious and so lopsided, I'd be happy to hear him out. But in the process of searching, I've really found the opposite to be the case.
I always tell my students, I'm like, let's talk. Let's discuss the truth. Because either Judaism is 100% true or 100% not.
Yeah.
And if it's 100% true, great. If not, let's go.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And I think like that type of dynamic is a compelling dynamic, because I feel there's a sense where we can kind of smudge the lines, right, when it comes to faith sometimes, or when it comes to religion. People feel like, okay, well, I believe this and not this. But when I tell people it is either 100% true or not true, you're forced to make a choice now. It is binary, right? And I feel like that forces people to reconcile. Well, did Mount Sinai happen? Was the Torah really given by God? And when you put it into those clear lines, I feel like some people are forced to reconcile. And they also feel, right, something that they don't normally feel in society, which is this thing called truth with a capital T, right? How often today do we experience truth?
Yeah. I mean, I'll get political just for a moment, but I think one of the most dangerous lines Kamala Harris ever said wasn't really on policy, but when she used the term "my truth" and "your truth," which I thought was really that is if Reshis Chachma Yiras Hashem, if the beginning of wisdom is the awe of God, then the opposite of wisdom begins with saying your truth and my truth. I mean, that is so wildly dangerous for the flourishing of a society that we can have subjectivity around things that are actually objective in nature. Yeah, you can have your opinions, but you can't have your own facts.
Yeah. And I feel like we today more than ever are dealing with the my truth syndrome, right? Where everyone can feel like they can live subjectively validated in whatever they perceive to be the reality. And obviously there can be tremendous implications for that and how they live their lives and how they look at their friends and how they look at because ultimately when you have nothing that pivots you and focuses you down, you'll float away, right? Imagine having a foundation of a building that's built on marshmallows. How far do you really go over here? When it comes to your experience in Judaism at Aish Torah, like, what was that like? Just want to double click on that for a second. Like, what was that experience?
Well, if my rabbis from Aish are watching, they can attest that I was not a model student. I think they're pleasantly surprised to see how I turned out eventually. I don't think they would have put their bets on me turning into what I am. They would.
Neither my rabbis.
Yeah. They, when they pictured me, the word juvenile detention often came into the conversation. So I think they're very surprised that I'm relatively a well-rounded person now. I liked it, and I always encourage young people, especially, that they need to be spending after high school at least a year in Israel. I don't say yeshiva and seminary because that throws people off, even though it really should be yeshiva and seminary. But I say you owe it to yourself. And I always say, by the way, going back to our earlier conversation, if at the end of your year you're not into this, then okay. I mean, I disagree with your conclusion, but at least you tried. Yeah. At least you can confidently say, I put in the hours. The same way I used to work for the National Council or Conference of Synagogue Youth, NCSY, and I would always tell the public school teens that I was working with, I said, if you don't want to keep kosher, if you don't want to keep Shabbat, I mean, it's your decision. There's literally nothing I can do to force you to do it or not do it. All I will say is you have to be educated and then make the decision. So you have to know what Shabbat is, and then you decide after years of study and toiling and questioning and debating, then it's not for me. And it happens to be the more you do that, the less likely it is you'll say it's not for me. But the point being, the biggest problem I have with so many young American Jews today is they make really consequential decisions without any educated reason behind it. That is really bad, really bad. And there are certain denominations, I won't say which ones, but they know who they are, who have lowered the standards so much that we have young American Jews who are functionally illiterate when it comes to their Judaism, and they're making wildly influential and impactful choices without any of the data in front of them to support those choices. So again, I'm not saying you have to keep Shabbat. You don't have to keep Shabbat, but you absolutely do. You have to be educated.
Have you been seeing, because of what's been going on campus, do you feel like today more students are saying, like, what is this? Why am I being condemned? Right? Because obviously the blur between anti-Israel versus anti-Judaism is very real.
Yeah.
Anti-Semitism is very real. And for some people, like, they're sensing that, well, shouldn't I explore why I'm being hated in the first place? Do you feel, do you see from your own anecdotal evidence?
Anecdotally, yes, I have seen students who would say, look, I'm not religiously observant, but I'll light Shabbat candles for a hostage, or I'll say a chapter of Psalms for the Israel Defense Forces, because they want to do something that is Jewish, and they did not have that education when they were younger. And in many cases, they're actually quite upset at their parents or their quote unquote educators or rabbis who did not actually educate them or show them what it means to be Jewish. And so, yeah, we're seeing those October 8th Jews who are rediscovering what their identity is. And on the flip side, as you were just suggesting, why do people hate us so much? Like, what is it about Judaism that sets people off? I better learn it. What makes people so emotional in either direction? Isn't that something that you would want to study?
And you were saying just before, as you were speaking, the concept of, like, this hatred's biblical.
Yeah.
Right? It's a biblical hatred. Right. So I don't know if you want to speak to that point a little bit, how you feel like it's almost like, because in some ways it defies logic.
Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism bothers me, I guess, on an intellectual level. I mean, I don't like when people are mean or when they're mean to me personally. Like, I don't like reading the comments on Twitter. It's not nice, but it's really, in my mind, a validation of what the Hebrew Bible had prophesied thousands of years ago, that so long as we are in exile, which we currently are in, you will be scattered and you will be small, and yes, you will be hated, and it will always be irrational and inexplicable and explainable. And the anti-Semitism that we're seeing today from both the far left and the far right is simply a manifestation of what God told the Jewish people thousands of years ago. So I actually just see it as validation. It concerns me because what starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews, and I'm concerned about the greater implications of anti-Semitism on Western societies like Canada, like the United States. So in that sense, it really bothers me. But on a personal religious sense, not really. It really doesn't faze me. Again, I wish there wasn't anti-Semitism, but I'm certainly not going to spend much time or certainly any money on quote unquote combating and defeating anti-Semitism. You cannot defeat an ideology. There will always be racists. It's a bad ideology and I abhor it, but you can't dictate or legislate your way out of a mentality. What you can do is you can lessen the amount of people who have that mentality. And I think by any objective standard, blacks in America are way better off today than they were in the 1960s and the 1950s. That doesn't mean racism isn't a thing. What it does mean is their lives are still so much better, even with the racism that unfortunately still persists.
So is one of the solutions, instead of anti-Semitism, or sorry, anti-Semitism, is it pro-Jewishness? Do you say, like, really consuming the multivitamin called the Jewish diet in some of the way, increasing our ideology and understanding?
You can cut this out, but I might have to end on this question, if that's okay. Yeah. So I always make this point, and it actually really frustrates me because I've been making this point literally since day one of my activism, and it essentially falls on deaf ears. But if your listeners, if the American Jewish community, if the Canadian Jewish community and the establishment and the Jewish nonprofits and all the legacy organizations, if they really wanted to combat anti-Semitism, and if they really wanted to meet this moment, take it from someone who went to Harvard, not to sue them, but went to Harvard to actually study the Holocaust. That's my academic area of focus. We do not need more Holocaust museums. We should go to the ones that are here. They're very good, and I encourage them, especially the one in Toronto. But we don't need more. We don't need more plaques. We don't need more anti-Semitism fellowships. Forget about the fact that they are so obviously ineffective in their stated purpose. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, their entire mission is combating anti-Semitism. So I often joke with Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the CEO of the ADL. I say, how's that going? How's the combating anti-Semitism stuff going? Because if your entire purpose is combating anti-Semitism, well, you're objectively doing a bad job at it. So instead of fighting an ideology that really can never be defeated, what you should instead do is double down on what makes us a unique people that have thrived for 3,000 years. Make sure there's not a single Canadian Jew today who's going to public school because their parents can't afford Jewish day school. Make sure that every single Canadian Jew has had the opportunity of going to Israel at least once on a fully sponsored birthright trip. Make sure the Canadian Jewish summer camps double their enrollment by next summer. Have positive Jewish experiences as early as possible, as quickly as possible, as young as possible. That's how we meet this moment. That, I think, is one of the only answers of October 7th. It's not another Holocaust museum, another dinner for a legacy organization. It's not another anti-Semitism fellowship. It's making Judaism Jewish again, making Jews Jewish again, reinvesting in I'm trademarking that, making Jews just have positive associations. And by the way, we know what happens when they don't have those positive associations. I always speak about the most painful moments at Harvard were when Jews would call for an intifada or pitch tents on the lawn or sign letters blaming Jews for 10/7. And these are Jews that we as a community have so obviously and largely failed. And we need to make sure that, as the saying goes, the best treatment is prevention. Make sure that these Jews in the future don't exist. I don't mean like literally. That mentality doesn't exist. Yes, to be clear, I'm not saying we kill them, God forbid. I'm saying the mentality of Jews who are so removed from Judaism and Jewish values, that mentality must be eradicated. And unfortunately, I don't think the American Jewish leadership and the Canadian Jewish leadership are doing a good enough job at that.
Well, it takes a massive amount of investment. We're in the business right now. We're literally sitting in the helm of a campus and young professional organization right now with Olimi Toronto, partnered with AISH Toronto, and what we do over here. And really, we're the lifeblood of trying to increase that mindset of identity. And we just had one of our global partners come and they said to us, Josh, like, you can 10x this because you need to 10x this.
Yeah.
Right. There's 40,000 people approximately within a demographic between 18 to 35. Right. And we still think like we're one of the most successful operations in North America. And we're still only hitting 800 people or 1,000 people.
Wow. And, I worked with Olami, with Rabbi Menachem Deutsch, and obviously I went to Aish for yeshiva. So, I know firsthand not only the good work that Olami and Aish does, but how necessary and imperative it is for that work to your point, needs to be amplified and 10x'd. And I think part of what I'm saying of Jewish education, Jewish experiences, positive associations, the practical application of that would be organizations like Olami, would be Aish, would be Chabad. They're doing the work on the ground, impacting people daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and you see the results. Literally, you can see them. You can talk to the results. These are human beings whose lives have been impacted and their ideologies and mentalities have been changed as a result of coming across organizations like Olami and Aish.
Well, we want to say a tremendous thank you to you, Shabbos, because, hopefully this is the beginning of a future friendship,
Yeah.
right? Where really we see tremendous things down the pipeline for the future of the Jewish people. And we need leaders like yourself to give us guidance on the ground of how to inspire, communicate, and educate, right? Even on the ground, because you have a vantage point. I think not many people have, right? You were mentioning you have some contacts in the White House who you speak to on a basis. You have some other people along the way. You're backstaging with a whole group, and like your window.
I said that just to flex.
I know, but the flex is real. Right? The guy who has muscle flexes, right? But that's
good.
Right? They flex because they got muscle, and I feel like that's an important window for us to share because like there's that vantage point that we hear like, oh, like this is what Shabbos is telling from his vantage point, and that cross collaboration from our window to be like, oh, here's from his insights of what we can do better or what we're seeing down the pipeline. And I don't know if you feel like this, but we were told that Canada is still like where we're standing right now, still 15 years behind the ball, like in terms of like its impact. Do you feel that way, or do you feel in some ways not?
I'll give you a politically correct answer, which is I am apprehensive about the future, not just of Canadian Jewry, but of Canadians. I look at the UK, I look at France, I look at Germany, and I'm very disappointed to see so many in the Canadian national leadership thinking that is a good way to go and that we should adopt those policies. And again, to be somewhat general, because I don't want too many people to hate me, but when you import the third world, you become the third world. And Canada has a strong tradition. It's a great Western democracy, but I think it is eroding all of that in the name of suicidal empathy. And the Jews will be the first ones to suffer, but they won't be the last ones to suffer.
A hard but Real point.
Yeah.
Shabbos, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. You like what you heard? Well, guess what? Click the link, subscribe, join us, connect with us so that we can continue to provide you fresh, awesome content. Thanks for joining.